Okay, well, we're going to get started. Thank you again for joining us. My name is John Bellman. I'm the school's program lead for the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm going to start the training webinar today. We're going to have a few other people giving you some tidbits along the way. They're our technical team, and I'll let them introduce themselves as they come up throughout this program. I do want to mention a couple of things before we get started. One, we are recording this, and we will be recording all of the questions and then putting the questions and answers up online, as well as the presentation later. I also wanted to let you know that we have muted everybody, but we will be accepting your written questions throughout the presentation, and I will try to take a, there we go. I will take a look at these periodically, we all will, and we will have some spaces where we will be answering questions after parts of the presentation. So please feel free to type those questions in, and we'll take a look and answer them when we can. And with that said, move that over here. Let's begin our program. So again, thank you very much for coming. Today we have a number of important goals that we're going to try to meet. The first thing is, at least for our agenda, is I'm going to go over the presentation goals. We have another items we want to make sure that you get. We're going to give a little bit of a background on how we got to this point. We're going to discuss very briefly the stakeholder process in regards to how we got to where we are and why we are where we are. Then we're going to go through some energy audit requirements. We're going to walk through the templates and the processes. We're also going to take a look at some of the requirements that are new. We are going to look at the technical review process, what we actually do when we get those draft documents from you all. We're going to wrap it up with a few tidbits that we wanted to convey to you, and we'll discuss future revisions, how we intend to approach that, and some questions along the way. The main goal of the presentation, however, is twofold. From your perspective as the program auditor, our goal is to provide you all with the information necessary to achieve success. This by no means guarantees success. That is, of course, on you, but one of the things that was asked of us from you all several times was to provide you all the information you needed to do your job, and that's one of the things we focused very intently on in this round. The other item is for the school districts. The goal of this presentation is to not only have you be successful, but have you be successful in regards to what you provide to the school districts, which of course is good information to allow them to make better, more informed decisions about some of their energy efficiency and conservation opportunities. Additionally, we did want to make sure that you understood the specifics in terms of what we changed and what the requirements are and our expectations are. We also wanted to make sure we cleared up any questions or misconceptions. A big goal of this training and of the new program is to allow you all to move as efficiently and effectively through this process as you can, and we think we've set up a pretty good system to allow that. So very quickly, this process really began back last year in 2014. We held 7 in-person meetings around the state and 2 additional online meetings. We had almost 120 stakeholder comments that we addressed, including and additionally 75 questions that we answered in regard to the process. The main goals and the feedback we received are the ones you see in front of you right now, which is to say the first and foremost was everyone wanted the program to be easier to use. There were definitely some clunky aspects that we worked through, but we definitely have achieved that. There was a request to maintain or improve information accuracy and reliability. Again, you all as auditors and commissioning agents, for that matter, have done a fantastic job over the last couple of years, really gaining the trust of the schools in terms of the information they receive and the choices they have made and the effects of those choices. The school districts made it very clear they do not want to jeopardize that data integrity. There was a request from all parties, again, to improve processes and increase efficiency. Our goal is the same as yours, to get these documents in and out of our hands as quickly as possible, but not jeopardizing the quality of the data that we're conveying. Next item was districts wanted more pathways to graduate from the program. And for those of you that don't know what that means effectively is that the school districts have spent or obligated their entire 23-year estimated public purpose charge funding supply. They would then get reimbursements through the remainder of the program. Once school districts do this, they are able to more freely work with entities such as the Energy Trust of Oregon in getting additional funds and resources. Lastly, we wanted to make sure we incorporated all stakeholder input. And I put that down there even though it's obvious to make sure you understand that this includes school districts and this includes contractors, auditors. It is absolutely important to us that you working in the program have everything you need to do a good job and that you convey to us the parts that are working and the parts that could be improved. And we'll move on. Actually, I'll take a quick, all right, no questions. Excellent. Come on, there we go. All right, so what has actually changed in the program? Well, very, very quickly, the big items that have changed were the guidelines. We updated the guidelines. We corrected errors and inconsistencies. We tried to improve clarity and ease of use. We incorporated all program changes, and we have additionally posted the guidelines online. This is important because as we move forward, one of the changes we've made to the program is to be a little more nimble in how we address errors or corrections in the guidelines or their documents. All of the documents that are the most current up-to-date ones will always be available on ODO's website, and so you will always have access to the most current version. I can appreciate saving older versions because you've populated certain fields, but it's always worth your time to check to make sure items haven't changed online, and we will be announcing when we do make these changes. The next big change that has really substantially changed the program is the tier system, or more specifically, the elimination of the tier system for measures. At this point going forward, all eligible measures in the program, all approved eligible measures in the program will be reimbursed up to measure life, and they may be implemented at any time. There are a few districts that have made some commitments to cleaning up some old measures from years past, and they will be expected to continue to move forward with those. But in terms of what districts may or may not do going forward, it is completely up to them. We of course hope they pick the most energy or the cost-effective measures that are there, but we know that energy efficiency, saving energy, and even saving money are not the only reasons schools and other entities take on these projects. Lastly, there are no longer any required EEMs. I know that's something we've had in the past. All Tier 1 measures needed to be implemented before you could move forward with Tier 2 or Tier 3. But again, with the elimination of the tier system, there is no more requirement. The only requirement is, if you will, is that you implement approved projects. All right. Well, not many questions, so this is pretty easy. All right, so energy audits and the reports. These are the issues that we were presented with from school districts and from auditors, and I'll go over them very briefly just to make sure you can understand again where we're coming from with the changes we made. First one, again, clarity on expectations. You will see, be very clear in terms of what we expect to see and what we don't expect to see. Again, our goal is to make this as achievable and successfully achievable as possible for you all, and we understand we need to be clear to make that happen. Energy audit approval process time. This is a huge part of this change and the program changes. We have set up a number of changes. When all implemented and all followed, we are very confident will not only improve the approval process time, but it will greatly improve the approval process time. This is a benefit to everyone. Doing what is expected up front and getting corrections done as quickly as possible saves you all time and money, gets the answers back to the district sooner, and to be honest, allows us to do other things as well. So that's a big focus of these changes. Next, as I mentioned before, energy audit accuracy. Accuracy, we want to remain exactly the same. There'll be a little discussion later on about the difference between accuracy and precision, but in terms of the information in the audits, we want it to remain as accurate, and in some cases even more accurate than in the past. Thank you. Energy audit costs. This is something we'll address a little later, but we are trying to bring into line the cost of the audits with other generally accepted norms in the U.S. right now. Clarity on how long audit reports are valid, another big issue. The answer here, quite frankly, is that audits are going to be valid as long as they are valid. And for a school district, that is not very helpful. But for a qualified auditor, that is all the information you need. That is to say, you will have backup documentation and reports. You will take a look at existing conditions. And if you feel that a measure needs to be updated or an audit report needs to be updated, that's a good reason. If you don't, that's another good reason. We'll ask for justification, but generally speaking, that's what we're going to be looking for. Clarity on how often a building needs to be audited. Again, that's something we've addressed, and we'll talk about a little more with targeted audits, but effectively it is that all buildings need to be audited at the whole building level at least once. After that, there are a number of options which we'll discuss later. Targeted audits, which were a huge success in the Cool Schools pilot program, have been incorporated into the program. So we now have whole building and targeted audits, both of which we'll explain a little more moving forward. Lastly, better integration with other ODO programs. One of the long-term goals of this and other programs at ODO is to more closely integrate them so that an entity entering into a project or a number of projects in different programs will be able to do much more seamlessly, at least as far as ODO is concerned. Lastly, oops, sorry, went too far. The changes. So what have we done? Well, in regards to what we've done, again, we've updated the program guidelines. We have changed the energy audit requirements and the audit report templates. We have put out a new qualified auditor RFQ, which all of you have either responded to or will need to respond to the next release, which do have all the new requirements that you are beholden to from this point forward. We have some technical review enhancements, which we'll discuss. We have the two types of energy audits, the whole building and the targeted, which again we'll talk about a little bit more later. We have the single audit report template, another huge improvement. A single report template that every auditor must use. There will be a little bit of a learning curve for you all in getting used to this, but the audit report template has been developed so that it contains all the information we need to have and we expect to have. It also allows ODO to review the same type of document from each of you every single time, which will greatly increase flow through. Lastly, we have eliminated baseline adjustments. The use of baseline adjustments can be discussed academically, but for the purposes of this program going forward, at least at this point, there are no baseline adjustments. School districts have made it very clear they are only interested in existing conditions as they are and existing conditions as they will be, not hypothetical conditions of what might be if something were different. And with that said, I will see if there are any questions. Thank you. Sorry if I've lost you for a second. I need to pull up the questions real quick, which you're not going to be able to see, but let me pull them up. We have, so the question that we have right now is from one of you all, which is you have been discouraged with the length of time, review time on ODO's end, and we have had several audits submitted way back in the spring and we still have not received a review. What is the estimated time we can tell school districts? Great question, thank you very much. So one of the things we have been working on very diligently over the last few months is to work through the backlog of audits that we have built up over the last year or two at ODO. The changes to the program we are suggesting now will eliminate many, if not most, of the issues that we have had in terms of getting these audits reviewed and through the program. Going forward, however, where we are is this. We are currently only working on audits that have been submitted and we're reviewing them in order of submittal. So there are some audits from earlier in the year that we are getting to right now. Our goal is to have all of the existing audits that we currently have in our possession back to auditors no later than the first quarter of this upcoming year. Now, for those of you with audits that have been in queue longer, it will be sooner than that, and we hope to have things done as quickly as possible. But our goal is to get these audits reports back as quickly as possible, get them revised as quickly as possible, so we can begin on the new template and the new process. In terms of what you can tell the districts, you can tell them that. We are at the point right now where you will have your audit reports back to you by the first quarter of this year. Again, we hope to have it sooner rather than later. That doesn't mean approved. That means you will have the revisions back to you. We have done some tweaking on our review process for these older audits to expedite things as much as possible, but there still are going to be a few corrections that need to be made. Okay, the next few questions look like both of those questions. Okay, the next few questions, and that is for Mitchell and Peter. I've just been told we are going to answer a little later in the presentation. They fit in a little better, but we are going to get to them. So, if there are no more questions for me at this point, I am going to turn the microphone over to Casey, you go first, or Tom. Tom, thank you. Tom Elliott, who's one of our technical folks here, is going to talk about energy audits and requirements in the document walkthrough.
Thanks, John. Start really quickly here and just point out a few things. When we did this redesign, we really took a lot of time and effort to think things through and organize things kind of in a modular, intuitive flow, basis, so that you didn't have to think a lot about where you were in a document, because it would be pretty natural. For instance, here, you look at the overall process. We're on the second arrow here, conduct energy audit. What happened before? Well, before the energy audit, talk about that in just a second. After you do the energy audit, you're going to create the report. Casey's going to talk about that in a few minutes. You submit the report, and then ultimately it's all toward the goal of getting the actual projects implemented. And then if you look within the actual column, then this is more or less a synopsis of what happens within each of these aspects of the program. And so within each document then as well, and you'll see that when we talk about the energy audit, that there's a chronological flow. So again, everything's designed to be very modular and intuitive. And then we'll also see that we're addressing the needs of efficiency and quality, accuracy, etc. First thing to point out, the very top paragraph, second sentence, is that the very foundation of these auditing requirements and the template for the report are all based on ASHRAE. We looked and checked everything against the procedures for commercial building audit second edition, which is referenced there and it's footnoted within the document. If you scroll down then a little bit to the bottom of the page, kind of note in the second to last paragraph that before you enter into a contract with the school district, make sure that that school district is in fact eligible for SB 1149 energy program, because that's going to inform the basis for reimbursement of the program costs related to the energy audit. As I mentioned a moment ago, the organization within this document is based on a chronological flow. Before the audit, during the audit, producing the report analysis and energy audit report, and then submitting the report. So the first point here is to note that number one on the list, be sure and assign a qualified energy auditor to lead the audit, and that's going to be the primary point of contact. Numbers 2 through 5 are pretty much all related to what I would call homework. Everybody loves homework, I know that. But in seriousness, homework and preparation, like many projects and tasks, on the road. And there's a reason by doing it by the book starts here. For instance, if you look at the second bullet point of getting the utility data and kind of looking at that, you can see that we asked for trends and abnormalities in consumption records, discuss it with the school staff, maybe generate a graph, and oh, by the way, that's going to be part of the energy audit report. And it probably should and does inform how you go about conducting the audit, what sort of information. If you scroll down and look further down the page, the next step during the energy audit. So again, the preliminary analysis on-site collection should be planned with a view toward creating the energy audit report. Very obvious, but you know, you need to follow all the requirements within this document, and also, oh, by the way, be very familiar with the template and whatever it is that you need to collect on-site or think about, you know, to prepare that template and that report. You need to keep that in mind when you're doing your audit. Let me highlight just one quick bullet point within number 1 down there. The very first one, that we're looking at accuracy now for the EEM cost and energy savings to plus or minus 20%. And it was formerly plus or minus 30%. Casey just highlighted a moment ago looking at measures with the payback less than 50 years, which she will actually be talking about quite a bit. But again, keep that in mind. Just because you know that it's not going to be a super long payback, you want to kind of keep in mind what's going to be the best sort of projects. And we'll come back to that. The next page, looking at then the energy audit requirements. I'm just going to highlight a few bullet points here. First one, a target energy audit may exclude some of the items, but you've got to get prior written notice from ODEL. Already we got a question about targeted audits. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. In fact, I'll come back to that later at the bottom of this document. We'll come back to that topic. Number 1, a qualified energy auditor must be present on the site of the audit. It's okay and a good idea to have teams, but included in that team needs to be somebody on the qualified auditor list. The last bullet point in that, an on-site survey must be done when the heating system is operational. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're in a heating-dominated climate here, particularly for school buildings. And it just makes sense to go on-site and do your audit when the heating system is working. Any sort of deviation from that, you need to get our approval from prior to doing that. Number 3, and that's the, again, collect information on any measure with simple payback less than 50 years. Casey will talk about that within the context of the report template. The second bullet point in number 3, and we know that, you know, we encourage you to have strong relationships with the schools, and we've designed and modified the program to be more flexible, and we know that the school districts have certain things that they're really more interested in than others, and that's great. But, you know, if you look at one of the sentences in there, you can't just focus only on a few certain measures. You have to look at everything. Or maybe, in fact, they do want to focus on just certain measures, which comes back again to the targeted audit, which we're going to talk about more in a few minutes. Number 6 down there, just really quickly, again, you're looking at your on-site. You need to keep in mind that you're going to collect information for the report. HVAC sequence of operations, Blake's going to talk a little bit about that. We're just kind of an overview. You know, how is the school heated and cooled? What's the strategy? How does it overall work? Same with fan schedules. You know, basically what we're interested in is understanding, you know, how the building uses energy. The next page. Number 8, a boiler combustion analysis for each boiler is required. We do realize that, in fact, have already okayed other combustion tests conducted by, it seems like it's most often going to be the person that's doing the regular maintenance and service on the boiler. And as long as they have all of the constituent elements that are listed there, and it's been done recently, almost certainly we're going to be okay to sign off. But you need to get prior okay and sign off from us on a written basis. And energy audit report and analysis, Case is going to talk about that. And then next, submitting the report, very first sentence there, it should go without saying, but bears repeating. Critical to ensure all information acquired, conclusion reached, recommendations, observations, evaluations are in accordance with Senate Bill 1149 requirements. So on the last page, this is where we're going to talk just very briefly about targeted audits. At this point in the program, most schools have had a whole building audit. Some of them are old. And again, I mentioned a moment ago that we want to have more flexibility, and school districts kind of have different things which aren't always necessarily the shortest payback energy items that we energy geeks might wish that they would do. You know, we're trying to be flexible toward that. And we've had a lot of success already with the targeted audit. So in this document, we've kind of formalize that just a little bit. So just to reiterate, the definition of a targeted audit has limited scope, typically focused on a single area of the building, specific energy system, or measure to be analyzed. And in some cases, it might be a couple different things, but it's not a whole building audit that will be brought out more in terms of the full requirements later. As a starting point, though, until we know better, everything is required from the RFQ, certainly, and then the scope of work should include everything to put together that full template, everything in the energy template, except what has been agreed upon. And then, okay, now we're going to go back to sort of an interaction with the auditors and based on interaction with the school on what really needs to be analyzed and supported to give information relevant to lighting or for just an HVAC. With the lighting, we may be, particularly if it's for lighting in a gym, we might be interested in having some information about the envelope. We might be interested in having some information about the HVAC system, but it's going to cost more time and money to put that together, and it's really not critical for the analysis and the question at hand, which would be gym lighting. But again, generally speaking, all requirements apply, and you need to get prior approval. And that very last sentence in the authorization just goes to that. And we want to make sure up front, that we are clear what's going to be revised or omitted. So at this point, then before we go into the template, we can look at a few questions and see where we are. Just scrolling through the questions here, bear with us for a moment.
All right. Hello, everybody. This is Casey Radcliffe. I'm one of the energy analysts here at Odo. So our next step is going to be, as part of that audit process that Tom took you through, we're going to discuss the actual energy audit report. And important thing to note is not only the energy audit requirements we just looked at, but this template and requirements and most of the other program documents are available online now. You'll see that the template is in Word format. We have an Excel file of the tables. So we're trying to give you these documents in their native form so they're most accessible to you guys. And the template and requirements, what we've done is that the requirements for the energy audit report are now embedded within the template. So what's really important is as we work our way through the template to note that the instructions and the items in the template appendices have the information of how to meet the requirements and expectations of the energy audit report. So we're going to switch over now to the template and walk through the document. All right, so as Tom mentioned, we are aligning more with ASHRAE standards. You'll see footnotes throughout the document that talk about the requirements that are referenced against the standards. So general requirements. The measures that you'll be looking at are going to have a simple payback of less than 50 years. We do have a reasonableness test around this in that we don't necessarily need every single measure that could ever be possible listed in the report, but the most important, the ones that are cost effective within what we consider the life of the building, this 50-year cap, should be included in the report. Other measures that are either of interest to the school that are past 50 years or measures that you specifically might know are off of the 50-year cap but are important to the school's interests or the desires of the school, you can include that in a bulleted list or a small description or summary, but the 50-year threshold is what we need to meet. And if we see existing conditions in the school that we don't see a measure around, we may have questions about why that measure wasn't reviewed. So it's really good in the narrative if there's something obvious that would be a potential measure but you didn't analyze it, to explain that either it's over 50 years or there is some other item around that. The next couple of bullets are just basically talking about this, the new template. We ask you all to follow the format, and we need prior approval if you're going to deviate from that format. And this is really for substantial changes like missing sections, missing tables. Small changes that are specific to the school are okay, but we really, because we are using this new template, need you to follow that closely. If you have questions about the template, we're happy to talk about it beforehand so that you don't get too far into the report and have to backtrack. Also around the QC process, really emphasizing we want clarity and consistency in the report. That's consistency in values, consistency in language, and then clarity around really telling us the story so that somebody who is familiar with the school but is maybe not an energy auditor can understand what actions they need to take. Into calculations and energy modeling, one of our biggest items that we work with improvement on is the calculation justifications and assumptions around those. We like to call it the show me your work principle, in that we need to be able to understand how your savings and measure results were calculated, and that can be in a combination of language, spreadsheets, modeling input documents, so really that we can track back through your work and validate the results of those savings. We also want them clearly stated and assumptions that were used, including how they came to be, whether that was through industry standard or validated in some other way, including a narrative around those. And then if your firm has been approved for energy modeling, we ask that you use building annual energy use hourly simulations. And the SEED program guidelines, which are available online, have an appendix around the building modeling guidelines. So we ask that you follow those. We also have included, which you'll see farther down, the ASHRAE modeling checklist to use as guidance. And then importantly, in the report itself, we want pre and post measure inputs listed in the report. It can be done in the appendix so that somebody who is not going to open the modeling files or the school who would receive the report can validate that the pre-EM inputs are accurate to the school, but also that the EM inputs into the model, that they can understand what is needed to meet the outcomes of that measure in the results of that measure. So going down into the template itself, we've used some formatting. You'll see the section headings, narratives have been italicized and bolded. The important thing here is those instructions, which are in smaller text and italics. That is where the bulk of the requirements of the document are held. Those can be removed when you're actually creating the audit report, but we really ask that you put a lot of focus and attention to reading those, and those should answer a lot of the questions that you have about what needs to be in the document itself. One small note, you'll see that we have a definition here of MBTUs. We know that there's some variance in how this is used in the industry, so we've defined it here as we'd like to see it. And acronyms, we've spelled out the most common, but we asked that for readability, that any acronyms you use, that you explain what the acronym stands for in the first time of use in the report. So the template has a cover sheet. This is fairly basic, and we want that standardized in the items that are included, but you can adjust the cover sheet as you need it for that first document as long as those items are in there. Standard table of contents. And then we get into the report summary. And our hope for the report summary is that this is the first few pages of the document that if the school was to read nothing else but this, they would be able to have the takeaway message of where they're at and where they could go. So this includes a new section, which is summary level detail that's concise but with the most important items, and then an executive summary with key findings. And this is really that tell your story. So we don't need this to be elaborate, but we want it to be concise and critical about what the recommended measures are and the most important things for the school to take note of. And then following that, we have our building energy summary table, which is that before and after, once all the measures are implemented, where the school could get. The important thing here is that there's a box for the EUI target. We have adjusted the target range, which is now based on the ASHRAE standards. It takes into account the ASHRAE climate zones, the school type, and the operating hours. So make sure to include the correct value, and then you can explain whether or not the measures listed in this report will allow the school to get to that value, or if not, what other elements maybe need to address, whether that's further design and engineering, higher level audit, maybe a whole audit if this is just targeted, to help them get closer to that measure. Then we move down to our EEM summary table. You'll see that from previous years, this has more columns added to more clearly define where savings are occurring by fuel type and also cost savings by fuel type. We've also included a utility rate summary at the top that just adds a little bit of clarity about where these savings are occurring. You will have a chance to use the Excel file. It does not have calculations embedded in the Excel, but hopefully you can use this to set up your savings. So if you need to change something like utility rate or the amount of savings in a particular fuel, you should be able to adjust the table quickly and more simply, and again, aligned more with what we would see in an ASHRAE Level 2 audit. This is one of the examples of where the instructions of the table are really important. We note here that the order in which the measures should be listed, and this is following load reduction, distribution system and equipment efficiencies, and then plant and heat rejection equipment upgrades. So we'll follow that order for your listing, also follow that order for your interactions, and we'll talk a little bit more about accounting for interactions later in the document. A new table that we've added to the program is the savings validation table. This was inspired by some fellow auditors, and we really want this to be considered the sanity or reasonableness check for not only ODO, but for auditors. This is the place where we want to make sure that the measures that are included are reasonable for the amount of energy being used in the school, but also reasonable for the measure type. This is the place where if you see abnormalities or measures that combined are saving a really aggressive amount of a certain end use, we would like additional information about that, but also really accounting for all of the baseline use of a school and then where those savings are coming from. you'll see following this table is a narrative section, and most tables now have a narrative below them. And this is really your chance to help us quickly and easily understand the results that are in those tables. So instead of us having to track back through the document to try to find why those results are valid, you can tell us right here in the narrative why the results in this table make sense. This is also how you verify them against the historical energy consumption, and where you can help us really do a quick QC on the results of the report. Down to energy consumption, this is a similar table as before, but note that we have asked that you do not use a blended rate. So in this case, if you have multiple rates, multiple utilities, we ask that you add rows and columns so that it's as specific as required to not just have a one set value as a blended rate. And moving down, we have a typical consumption profile. This needs to include at least 2 years of data, preferably longer, and really preferably longer if one of the years is abnormal for the typical operation of a school. A lot of our schools have quite a bit of time and length in their energy reporting now, so you should be able to get this data fairly easily and then map those 2 years of consumption data on line graphs, and following those line graphs include some narrative about any seasonality in the usage, any abnormalities that stand out. This could include something like equipment that has switched fuels, change in operation of a school, and then any relationships that are really important to note here that might affect either the baseline or the results of a measure savings. For end-use split estimates, we're going to talk in more detail about the methodology behind end-use estimates, but here is really where we want you to note all the categories and the percentage of baseline energy use in those categories. We do ask that you do the end uses that comprise more than 5%. However, if they are smaller but are an important component of the school, like domestic hot water, exterior lighting, we would want those noted, especially where there's a measure related to those. This table and some of the others is a good example of where consistency is really important. That total row at the bottom, we would hope to see that those totals are the same totals that we would see in the energy consumption profile and the baseline energy use for the schools. And when there's large variation in there, that can really add to the QC turnaround. So here's a really great place where all those total rows should be within 10% of one another, especially if it's in modeling. And again, table follows a narrative, and that narrative gives you a chance to point out anything that's particularly abnormal or important related to measures that you're going to describe later in the report. Then we have building occupancy. This is just to explain the occupancy of the unique space types in the building. You can add rows as needed. And again, a narrative where you can explain the typical operation of the building, anything that is of concern or of interest that was noted, and then also how it would relate if you have any equipment operating or HVAC scheduling items later in the narratives or the EEMs that are important around occupancy. And finally, before we switch over, we have the general facility description. This is the place where you describe the construction type, installation values, and then anything unique to the major components of a building and its characteristics. We ask that you include the U and R values where appropriate, and then for installation values, we'd like to see the buildup of how those installation and R values were created, so we can understand the values, especially where they are atypical of what we would normally see. And again, including narrative for anything that is odd, but also just making sure you include all of the items in the instructions under each section. And then finally, we ask that you include a current, legible, simple line floor plan and pictures of the major building elevations and photos of any building elements or systems that are important to the building or that the photos help describe a condition that you're going to address in an EEM. We'd rather have more photos than less, and you can also include additional photos in the appendix if ever needed. So now we're going to switch over to Blake, who's going to take us through the rest of the document.
Thanks, Casey. This is Blake Shalai. I'm a facilities engineer with Odo. I'm going to start talking about the energy using systems description as part of the energy audit report. And here is where you will start to provide the details for the systems within the facility that use energy. And just in general, the narrative should include any explanations for the system age, condition, type, controls, which areas are served by different pieces of HVAC equipment, along with kind of the general sequence of controls and sequence of operations for the various HVAC and energy using equipment throughout the school, as well as any known issues that you learn and glean from the facilities staff. In general, this information should be enough to provide the necessary background to understand the narratives that are coming later within the audit report within each EEM. So here's kind of where you lay the foundation for the equipment that's in the school to then be added to later on for specific details as associated with each EEM. When energy modeling is used, just be sure to provide an adequate description of the parameters and the building characteristics that go into the model. We don't just want to have all these pieces of information buried within an energy model file. It needs to be actually present within the report as well. We understand that as you're gathering a lot of the data, some of it may not be readily known, but through your auditing process is part of the role of the energy auditor to gain the best understanding that you can of some of the operating parameters, and then to note where that information came from and the source of it, whether it's a design document, whether it's from talking to facility staff and personnel, if it's from some of the data logging that you did, just to note what your assumptions are and where the data came from. And in particular, where there's going to be an EEM that's developed, we would expect that data to come from a credible source and to be confirmed through your on-site auditing process and not be a broad assumption. So I think that kind of covers the general requirements of the energy using systems. And now we'll kind of move on to the specific energy systems within HVAC. Here's where we want to see, the first thing that we really want to see is an HVAC zone floor plan. And one of the things that we like that a lot of the auditors do is provide a colored, kind of a color-coded map for which HVAC systems serve which zones. And that really helps the reader, it helps us, it helps the school to kind of understand what the, which applicable parts of the EEMs apply to which areas, and just to make sure there's complete understanding of the HVAC systems throughout the system. We want to see within the HVAC system description a sequence of operations and the fan schedules, and make sure when you're defining the fan schedules and the HVAC system schedules to clarify what those on an occupied versus non-occupied schedules and how those differ from what might be the school's occupied and unoccupied schedules. We've seen some confusion and some crossover between those definitions within the audit reports in the past, and that just leads to kind of a lack of clarity and sometimes reviewing the audit reports and really understanding what equipment's running when. Is it running when the school's not occupied, or is it occupied? So that just to make a distinction between what occupied and unoccupied means for various equipment and for the school itself. For the boiler and chiller plant, just give a high-level description of if the school has a boiler and a chiller, what sort of equipment it has, the general size, which areas it serves, and similar for the other HVAC air side, any sort of packaged units, and then the controls equipment at the school. This is the part of the report that you just give a high-level description of what's present. And one note that we want to make here is that if, say for instance, a school doesn't have a boiler or a chiller, we still want to see a confirmation of the negative here in the report, just to say no boiler present at the facility, just to make sure that that area was covered and that it's in the report just for documentation purposes. Similar for the domestic hot water, just provide a summary level description of the equipment, area served, the settings, and what part of the facility it serves, what sort of fuel it uses, and similar. For lighting, the main area here within this section of the report will just be a general summary of the type of lighting that the facility has. Say it's got T8s within the classrooms and high bay metal halides in the gym, or something similar to that, with a more detailed lighting inventory to come later within the appendix. But within this section, it's just kind of a high-level description of what lighting is there and kind of where it serves. And then for plug loads and other equipment, just a summary level description for any of the major plug loads that are at the facility. So now we're moving on to the energy efficiency measure section of the report. And within this section, this is where you go into a little more detail in describing the existing conditions at the facility that led you to determine that there's an opportunity for energy savings. So kind of the main theme here to remember is that within this section, you've got to build the case for the energy savings measure itself to really just describe where you see an opportunity for savings, to make sure it's fully documented and fully vetted and can be fully understood by somebody reading the report. And that's both for our purposes, for the school's purposes, so they understand where the savings are coming from, really what the mechanism for the energy savings is. And then for whoever takes this report later on, maybe the designer and the engineer or the contractor who's going to actually be acting off of the audit report to make the improvements. So within this section, we're kind of moving from the what is there and what exists portion of the systems level description to what is causing it to use more energy than needed, and then just like I said, building the case for the savings. And we want to make sure that any opportunity for savings here are based on data that can be supported and that was gathered during the audit, and not a broad assumption for a typical building type, that it's really specific to that facility itself. And so the next section of the EEM section of the report is the recommendations for the EEM. So we take what the existing condition is, and then now what are the proposals that you're recommending as an auditor, and a clear description of how those recommendations are going to be saving energy within the school. So that the school can know what the measure will require, and that that they can go forward and hire an engineer to then go forward and do the design and specifications work. We certainly, at this level, are not expecting the auditors to do any sort of design documents, but to give enough information that somebody can pick it up and then do so. And just one point of clarity here, that we want to make sure that every recommendation, certainly meets the current energy code requirements in Oregon. That's just a minimum requirement that we have, and that the school would have and the state would have as well. So, also within the recommendations section, we want to make sure to describe any non-energy benefits that are associated with the particular measure. We'll give a pretty good definition of the energy savings, but there may be other non-energy related benefits like operations and maintenance savings, maybe health, safety, and similar to that. So we want to make sure that the school has a complete picture of what some of the other ancillary savings are going to be, and these may be the parts of the measure that really make them go forward to act on that measure. But where you are able to quantify a savings, say you're changing out to LED lighting, it's going to really reduce the maintenance and replacement costs over the next few years, and it saves on time. Any quantified non-energy savings should be listed here within the narrative, but not included within the measure energy savings summary itself, because for the purposes of the program, the reimbursement amounts are strictly based on energy savings. And here's also where we would expect the auditors to list if commissioning will be required for a particular measure, and if it triggers any of the necessary commissioning thresholds for the project. So we want the schools to be aware if commissioning is going to be required. We want it to be kind of front and center here within the EEM recommendation, so that it's well known from the start, because as we all know, commissioning can be a major benefit, particularly for larger projects, and where that's required, we want to make sure that it gets carried forward. So the next section within the EEM area is the measure interaction. So various EEMs can both interact with, within themselves or with other EEMs that you might propose. So where you might have multiple EEMs that maybe all save heating energy, that all reduce the natural gas consumption of a school, depending on the order that you implement them in, some of the savings may change. If you're implementing a load reduction measure and a boiler change out, the savings may be kind of interdependent. So in order to make sure we don't double count or double dip into the savings, we followed the ASHRAE standard for order of analysis, where you start with the load reduction measures first, calculate the savings there, and then cascade down to the distribution system and associated equipment efficiency savings, and then finally any plant savings. So we feel that this method will prevent any overestimation of the savings and not double counting across measures that might affect the same ultimate energy use source. But at the same time, so with that said, we do recognize that sometimes schools will want to implement a particular measure, and we don't always know exactly the order that the school is going to be implementing the measures in. So if you, through your energy analysis, you recognize that an in isolation energy savings is going to have a significant variance, greater than that error band that we require for the savings of plus or minus 20%. We do give room within the report and within the tables to list that in isolation savings. So where there's going to be a big difference between the combination measured savings and in isolation savings, we want to give you guys the opportunity to perform that analysis for the school and to list that in the report as well for the purposes of reimbursing the school for the appropriate amount for the project. So where any school asks that, or if they identified that they definitely want to do one project, a boiler replacement project, before they do any load replacement or load reduction measures, certainly please do calculate that in isolation savings as well so that the school can have that information. And moving on to the energy calculation methods section. So here's where you'll give a brief overview of the calculation methods and the equations and the various spreadsheets and whatever other methodologies that you use to calculate what the energy savings of the particular measure are. And we just wanted to highlight here that the calculation methodology must be clearly summarized and then with any supporting documentation to follow in the appendix. And where you do calculations with an energy model, please list any and identify any key values and modeling inputs here in the report, and don't just maybe a change log of the energy summary of the energy model changes within the body of the report, so that it's not just buried within the model file itself. The next section of the EEM part of the report is the cost-benefit analysis, and for the most part, this table is pretty self-explanatory. It's where you just list the EEM number, a brief description to give an indication of what the EEM is, and then the associated savings that go along with that EEM, both the energy savings and the cost savings, with the simple payback calculated, as well as the measured life listed on this table. And you kind of see the below section, the bottom row of the table. So this is where you might list the in isolation measure savings if it's not done in a combination with some of the other measures, if there's different measures that all interact with each other. So in addition to measures maybe interacting with each other, some measures also have interaction measures with themselves. The most common example is a lighting project that changes the heat load of a school too. So where a measure interacts with itself, certainly just list the energy savings maybe associated with electricity and maybe an energy increase associated with a small fuel increase for the lighting project example within the same line associated just within that one EEM. Just a couple other notes for this one. We do have an area for peak demand savings in kilowatt, and just be sure to, if you're listing a peak kilowatt demand savings, that it's really applicable. Sometimes we have an electricity savings project, for example, exterior lights that are only on at night that do save kilowatt hours, but due to time of use may not really have a kilowatt demand saving. So make sure if you're including that in there that it actually has an applicable savings as well. And also make sure that any values that are listed in this table match up to some of the other summary tables that are listed in previous parts of the report, where if you might make a change and an update to one section, make sure it gets updated in another part of the report as well. And as Casey mentioned earlier, all these tables are available in Excel format on the ODO website for your use and population. So the next section of the report is the operations and maintenance measures, where if through the course of your audit you identify various operations and maintenance measures that might also save energy, this is where they go. One point that I wanted to make here, we talked a little bit before about the baseline adjustment and the change about how we're moving forward to no longer performing a baseline adjustment for the historical energy use of the school. But if through the course of your audit you identify an EEM that might have an impact on the energy usage, both from a savings perspective and there might be some component of that EEM, or you recognize an opportunity for a change that might increase the energy usage of the school. One of the examples that we see is if a school, if you suspect that it doesn't have the amount of ventilation that might be required to meet ASHRAE 62.1, and you would recommend to the school to maybe do some testing and balancing, or to open up some of their dampers, to run their units for fully, for the fully occupied hours, and bringing in that excess ventilation would increase the energy uses of the school. Here is where we would want you to show what that energy impact would be. And I think we had a question earlier about, what if a piece of equipment is broken at the school, and through the course of your audit, you recommend that piece of equipment is to be brought online again. This is where you'd also show the energy impact and increase, because that's really an operations and maintenance change of the school. So this section is not only for operation maintenance savings, but also for any any increases as well. And we feel that this provides a more transparent and clear picture of the changes that are being recommended to the school, both for the school to understand, for the auditors as you put together the report, and for us as we review it as well. Because in the past we saw a lot of confusion and some inaccuracies, and just in general not a very good amount of transparency and understanding about exactly how the baseline adjustments were being calculated for hypothetical situations that may or may not have been happening at the school in the past and may or may not have been operating at the school in the future as part of the recommendation. So we feel that breaking it up into the savings components and the increase components really provides the best picture for the understanding of everybody involved. And then for low and no cost EEMs, we've also provided a section here. Many of the same requirements with a capital associated EEM are required for the low and no cost EEMs as well. So now, after you've gone through and put all the information into the body of the report and described your energy efficiency measures that are to be recommended for the school, this is where you put all the supporting information in the various appendices throughout the report. In general, the appendices will kind of fall into four general categories. One, you'll have the general information appendices, which will provide the backup information for your end-use calculations, your modeling documentation, your equipment surveys, and your sequence of operation. You also have EEM-related appendices that will provide background for the EEM-specific requirements. It'll show your calculations on how you arrived at the savings that were presented in the body of the report, the background for the cost estimations, as well as any cut sheets or other documents that you need to support your measure. You also show your site measurements, whether this is charts of your data logging. It'll provide documentation for when you visited the site, and any sort of graphs or charts that you need to show to demonstrate the data that you gathered on site. And then the final section of the appendices, or the administrative appendices, and you may notice that these were previously located within the body of the report, somewhere toward the front of the report, and we've just moved these appendices because we feel that they're not as critical of pieces of information that you need to see necessarily right upon opening the report. We'd rather get to the executive summaries and some of the savings measures, and that these are probably better served just to be in the appendices. And just in general, as you're putting together your appendices, we just want to make sure that they're clearly organized with proper headings, titles, and notes and references, so that if you reference an appendix within the body of the report, say C energy efficiency calculations appendix G, that we know where to turn and that it's easily locatable. So within the general information appendices, the first section, the energy end-use calculations, here's where you'll provide a background for how you arrived at your breakdown for your end-use splits. There's a variety of ways that you can determine the end-use splits. We recognize that item A there, detailed measurements of end uses measured over time, is likely not going to be a very feasible method to determine it, since you are likely only at the site for a week or two, and you won't really have, there's not really sub-metering data on every end use at the school. But we expect the end use calculations to be probably a combination of B and C, based on your spot measurements and your data logging, and then calculations for how you arrived at some of the end use splits. And some of these end use splits and their calculations might be part of say, for instance, like an energy model or a more complex EEM calculation. So where they are, I'd say just go ahead and point to that. If it's to be contained later in the report, that's fine. Just go ahead and reference it. If you're providing energy and if you're approved to do energy modeling, you'll also want to include the energy modeling documentation in this general information section of the appendix. So you'll want to talk about which model you used, how the model was calibrated to the utility data to be within 10%, and then provide some of the key modeling inputs and similar. And we've also provided the ASHRAE hourly simulation checklist just as a general QC, so that you guys have it. You guys probably already have it anyways, but we feel it's a pretty good checklist to go over as you're developing your model to make sure everything's covered. And we know that a lot of you guys are very experienced energy modelers too. So the next few tables in the report pertain to the various equipment surveys that you'll be asked to fill out as part of the energy audit process to document what the equipment present at the school is. These tables are largely from ASHRAE with a few modifications. In general, we know that the information for every single cell in this table, every single column and row, may not be available and may not be applicable for every single school, or in every single facility that that you visit. So what we ask is that you do your best. You gather the information that's readily available. At the school, maybe there's a manual or documentation where you can fill this out. Maybe there's a nameplate, and it's not too hard to go and look up nameplate data. In many cases, if the model is a relatively new model, I know a lot of nameplates are scratched off, or non-existent. If the data is simply not available, that's certainly understood. But please just mark that within the report. And say a facility doesn't have boilers, it's not necessary in this portion of the section to include the boiler table and say not applicable. We would just say you don't need to include the table at all because you would have already noted that there's no boilers in the school previously in the report. And it's a good idea to have these tables generally in mind before you go do your audit, so you know what data is expected to be collected, so you make sure to gather it while you're on site and don't need to go out and make another visit, or don't need to go out and call the school to try to get more information out of them. And we've already talked a little bit about the combustion efficiency test, but this is something that we expect you to do for whole building energy audits and for audits that are centered or targeted audits that are centered around the heating system. But you can use existing tests if they're relatively recent and if the school has the available information. The next few tables are pretty self-explanatory. They're just associated tables for the various equipment that may or may not be present within the school that just does a good job to document the various parameters associated with those pieces of equipment, or whether it's chillers, cooling towers, airside equipment, and so forth. Domestic hot water too. So kind of the next main section that we want to talk about is the lighting. So as you're going through and doing a lighting inventory for the school, we do kind of expect a space-by-space fixture count, and then a general measurement of the foot candles and the watts per square foot for various space types, not for specific classrooms. So if a facility has 100 classrooms, we won't expect a specific foot candle measurement for every single classroom, but if you know the range after measuring a handful of classrooms that they're all within a certain foot candle range, certainly that is that's appropriate, and that's that will be acceptable for our purposes. We don't need individual values for each space for those two columns. And then through your audit, we'd also expect you to list some of the major plug loads that are present at the school as part of the equipment survey, and this is more of just a bulleted list without a table associated with it. And so here within the sequence of operation is where you might supplement some of the information that's contained previously in the report in the systems description, where you can provide some of the background documents for how you determined what the current sequence of operation is at the school, whether or not that's referencing existing design documents, or that's referencing some of the data logging that you did, or talking to the school to figure out when equipment comes on, when it operates, what some of the set points are, and so forth. So now moving forward to some of the EEM-related appendices. A lot of the information contained within these bullet point lists in the appendices section may also be described previously within the body of the report. But here's kind of where, if you haven't described it within the body of the report, or where the background documentation is possibly too lengthy and kind of clogs up the body of the report, this is where you would put some of that background information. So, as auditors, you can probably just use your best judgment on, determining what goes in the body and what goes in the appendices. But we've provided this section of the appendices to kind of as an overflow for the body of the report. But we don't expect duplicate information. If you put it in the body, it doesn't need to be in the appendix, and vice versa. As far as controls measures go, I know we've had some questions around exactly what the requirements for for documenting the existing control systems are. So I just wanted to make it clear that we don't expect you to develop any sort of P&IDs or list of the detailed existing controls points for the school. It's not what we require. We don't require you to do any sort of design documents for the recommendations, but we do expect a narrative if you're going to add any controls points or change any of the operations. We expect a description of what's to be added and what's to be changed. So for particular lighting measures, I think the only point that I really want to make here is that we do require photometric calculations to be performed for areas where we need to show whether or not they're meeting the IES recommendations for both the existing and the proposed scenarios. Where we see this a lot is in exterior lighting, particularly like in parking lots where the school may not be meeting the existing recommendations as they are currently, but we feel that it's our duty as program managers and it's your duty as auditors to, if you're making a recommendation, to give the school the necessary information to understand that even if they're not meeting them now, they may not have the physical capability due to maybe the quantity of light fixtures that are there to meet them in the future, but the school needs to understand where they sit with relation to those measurements and those standards, so that they have a full picture of what the future proposed situation is going to look like, so that they can move forward with that. So for situations like that, we do require the photometric calculations to be provided and to be clearly stated in the report so that it's understood by the school district. The next couple tables are very similar to the lighting equipment survey table that I already looked at, but one is the baseline and one's proposed. So this just provides a pretty simple table to document the existing and proposed situations and then to calculate the savings within this table itself. So. And next section is the familiar SB 1149 measure life table that we've provided here, basically just for reference, but you can see all of the measure lives associated with various pieces of equipment. And if we do update this table in the future, you guys will certainly be the first to know that. And as you're calculating the measure life for maybe an EEM that has multiple components to it that have different measure lives, we calculate the EEM total measure life on a cost-weighted basis, and this just provides an example of how to do that. And what we need that weighted measure life in order to calculate the program reimbursement and the measure life savings for the school. And the next section of the EEM-specific appendix is the EEM calculation section. So within this section is where we would expect you to detail all of your calculations on how you arrived at the energy savings that are presented previously in the report. If you reference any sort of spreadsheet calculations, you can certainly do that here, just so that we know where to find the calculations themselves. And if you end up doing energy modeling for a particular measure, you might also include a summary of the key model inputs and output values for the EEM. within this section too. So the next item in the next table is the EEM cost estimation table, where we would expect to see a breakout between the materials and the labor cost for a particular measure and the particular components within that measure. And we want to make sure that all sources for the cost estimates are cited. We do allow and we expect the cost estimates to come from a variety of sources, whether that's RS means, previous projects that you guys have done as auditors, or maybe that the school district has done, direct quotes from vendors and installers. Certainly those are all valid locations for cost estimates, but just make sure to note where you got your cost estimates from. And we also want to note here to make sure that any estimated commissioning cost, if commissioning is required for a particular EM, that those are listed here in the cost estimation as well, and that it's noted. But we do want to make sure that it's listed, separately on its own line there, so that it's clearly stated and visible to the school district. Okay, and so the next section of the EM cut sheets of the appendices are related to any sort of cut sheets that are associated with proposed equipment that you might want to present to the school to give them a better idea for what equipment you're proposing, or you'd propose them to install as part of the recommendation. And the next section, so moving on to the site measurement. Oh, I guess I skipped over the commissioning. Just make sure to note if commissioning is required. And here are the thresholds that I mentioned before for when commissioning is required. So it's for all HVAC projects and DDC capital projects that are over $50,000, and then any plant like boiler, chiller, or lighting control capital projects that are over $100,000, or when commissioning is required. And we have a pretty detailed commissioning RFQ and commissioning requirements as part of our program that you can certainly feel free to reference within this part of the report. The next section of the appendices will be the site measurements appendices, where you'll document when you visited the site, who was there, and the purpose of the visit, and then also which data logging monitoring equipment that you used, when you installed it, what the period was, and then any issues that you may have seen through your energy monitoring process. And then here's also where you present some of the results, whether that's a chart, a graph, a table of any of the specific key pieces of information that you measured. And we would expect that where a piece of information is particularly applicable for an EEM, that it's listed here and clearly described. And certainly feel free to list any call-outs on your charts and on your tables to point to various anomalies or things that you noticed, especially as they pertain to energy savings opportunities. And the final two sections of the appendices are familiar sections that we've just moved to the back, and these are the administrative areas to identify the various institutional contacts, the contacts within your audit firm and who prepared the report, and then the signatures and certifications of the energy auditor, the modeler if applicable, and the senior reviewer. And one note that I wanted to make here, that if a firm has multiple qualified personnel, we do now require that the senior reviewer be a separate person from the energy auditor. So we all know that it's certainly more productive to have somebody else check our work, and that's basically the reason for the change, if it's possible. Oh yeah, so I mentioned that where you have multiple qualified personnel, we do require that. If your firm has only one qualified person, or if your firm is small, if it's only one person, then we do recognize that you have to do your own QC, and that's okay.
All right, so we've wrapped up that section, and we have a few questions, so we're going to answer at least a few of them before we do our technical review process, final thoughts, and a few more questions after that. The first was describe the operating hours for school. Is this when students are on campus, when teachers are there, when janitorial? So Tom's going to talk about that really quickly.
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, in this section, what we're most interested in, kind of when the people are there and how they're using the spaces and which space they're in. So, the teachers and the students when they're in the classroom, the admin in the office, the gym, after hours, that kind of thing. And this is ultimately going to be driving the energy use. And then later, we'll compare it against, like for instance, the lighting is left on all night, or the HVAC is running on the weekend when it's not occupied. So later, that sort of issue will come into play. But right here, what we're really interested in is what people are there doing, what things, during what hours. And a little bit of note that there is a little bit of narrative asked for it, explanatory there. So if there's anything unusual there, that would be the place to kind of just note it.
All right, the next one is, will ODO require us to do photometric analysis? I think Blake talked a little bit about that. And yes, it is required where safety is a concern. But I think a related question of that is, if photometric calculations are required for proposed lighting retrofits, can we expect to document ASHRAE 55 compliance for HVAC?
I don't think we have any direct plans for documentation of compliance, although, I mean, I think certainly the expectations there that if any proposed changes are made, that they're not being made in such a way that the changes wouldn't allow for proper thermal comfort within the school.
And then lastly, we have that comment and question that the reports will be highly comprehensive, certainly more than required to implement some good EMs. What is the reason for this additional level of effort? One clarifying factor that we've talked about in the program is that the template report and requirements, while the template has significantly changed and a lot of narrative and items have been added to the template itself, the expectations and requirements of what's in the report has actually not changed significantly. What we've tried to do is provide additional description about what we hope to see in the report and tables to provide examples of how that information can be best illustrated. But the actual requirements of the level of detail have not changed a whole lot in the program. And those of you who've worked with us, you've probably seen us ask for these things or ask where to find these things in the QC process and turnaround process. So our hope is that we actually aren't asking for a lot more. We're just being more clear about where and how that information can be documented. And if you guys have ways to improve that, I think we're definitely open for that, and we'll talk more about that for future revisions. But our hope is that it's more streamlined, so it's more like the audits that you would do outside of our program in ASHRAE Level 2 industry audits, but also that we're just being more clear about the work you guys were already providing us and just doing it in a faster and maybe more streamlined way. So with that, we're going to go to our technical review process. Just a few comments about getting back to that, how can we get audits done quicker and back to the schools faster, and then some final thoughts.
So thanks everyone for bearing with us. So just going back to this again, where are we on the timeline? You've done the energy audit, you've created the report, now you send it to us. What happens? When you think about what takes time here, what's driving the review time, there's kind of a couple elements to that. There's the review time to look at the report itself, and then if we have any questions that need clarification, revisions to be made, then we go back to the auditing firm and ask for that. They send something back to us. We look at it again, and so there's another sort of cycle of looking at it. And each time you open the report, there's just some fixed costs from just anything from opening to it, to going through it, to refamiliarizing yourself, re-immersing yourself in whatever sort of questions there are. So the changes that we made were really oriented toward addressing both of those, to make the cycle through each kind of review of the report much quicker and more intuitive, and then as well, basically to reduce the number of cycles. So just to kind of give you some insights into kind of what we're thinking about, and again, we did truly make very few changes in terms of the overall content, mostly just kind of rearrange some things. So our vision here is to take the report, open it up, look at the front of it, and in the first few sections really get an idea of what's going on in the school. So some basic background when the school was built, kind of the vintage type of equipment, etc., and what was all, what was found in terms of conditions and the overall EEMs. And then a little bit of tabular information on the EEMs. How's that going to put us in terms of the EUIs? And then the total, all right, let's look at the total set of EEMs and get a little bit more understanding, a few more levels of details, but again, just the total set of EEMs. And then that validation table. The validation table we're going to be looking at to see if the results are reasonable. And also, we're hoping that you do your own, you being the audit firms, do QC as well. And if you see something that has very high savings, either an absolute or relative to the end use, that you really scrutinize it internally. And if you can't really explain it simply, like what's driving it, and then also back it up with all the details, then maybe you need to go back and revise the calculations. And then after that, okay, now we've got a good understanding of the building. We see what the key opportunities are. Now I'm kind of ready to go back and look at a few things that are driving that. First, I kind of want to orient myself. Well, how is the school using energy? What's the kind of profile month to month? Have another look at the end use. And then sort of, all right, who's there when, and that looks kind of high, what, oh, okay, I see, they have, wow, they're open all year round, that's kind of funny. Oh, take a quick note, oh, I see, they have a large after-school programs, they have summer stuff, all right, very quickly, I've understood some things, they're going to drive energy. And it's that kind of theme that we'd be looking at. When we go to the level of details, the EEM, then we'd be looking at, we already know what the key EEMs are. I'm probably not going to look at the onesie-twosie, but I'm going to look at the ones that are driving most of the energy savings. Does it make sense? Does it tie back to the overall description of the envelope or the energy using systems? Yes, it's all check, check, check. Now I've got a good feeling. Everything's documented every time I go from front to back to look at more detail or less detail. It all is hanging together. I can find my calculations. I know what the assumptions are. Now, in terms of the triage approach, so that describes what happens, and that report's going to be ready for kind of to knuckle down and look at it in complete detail and pretty much review it with the idea that we'll send back, the report will be more or less approved. We'll ask for a few onesie-twosies sort of corrections, but everything's done. Now, on the other hand, if we go through this process, get lost along the way, oh, that looks really high as far as, I don't really understand this. What? Wait a minute, I can't find the explanations. It starts falling apart. I do finally find the calculations. I can't make any sense of it. The thing falls apart. We probably don't want to spend a lot of time on that. We're going to probably kick it back to you because, quite honestly, we just can't be the QC department for the auditing firms anymore. The graph down there, if you find yourself in A where you're missing the mark, really not understanding it, we're much more interested in you moving toward B where you're not exact, but you're describing the situation. We're much more interested in being approximately correct than precisely wrong, which would be C. And then if you go to the next, we had a few firms along the way ask us, well, we want a full detailed list of the QC items. And we purposely did not do that. This is kind of a summary of the key things that we found again and again. And that basically we're really looking for you to look at the template, look at the requirements, read the instructions carefully, and I think it really will be intuitive and make sense, and that most of these QC items will be avoided. So again, the idea is one and done. We have one sort of review, and we're finished. So that's basically our goal in all of this.
Too far? There we go. Okay. Thanks, Tom. This is John again. We'll check to make sure there aren't any additional questions from Tom's talk. But to wrap up Tom and move to the last item, the real general gist of the new audit requirements is there may be a little more effort up front on the auditor's part, but the subsequent back and forth and review process should be greatly expedited. Additionally, once you start becoming familiar with the auditing template, you will find, I am quite sure, that as Casey said before, the information we're asking for has not changed substantially. We have simply required that it be put in a single template. Moving on from that item, we had a few items we wanted to discuss with you all that didn't fit nicely in the previous constructs, so these are a little bit random, but they are all very important. First and foremost, you all have been qualified, pre-qualified to provide auditing services to these schools. And because of this, because of the difficult effort in becoming qualified and the effort we're taking right now in making sure you understand things, we are taking the next step and making it very clear that you all are the ones responsible for understanding the guidelines and the program requirements. We are always here, of course, to answer questions, but the situation where a school district might ask for something or understand something differently is fine. They can be educated on that. You all do not have that excuse. You all will be provided all the information, again, that you need, and we will expect that the program will be followed. If there is a issue with a district wanting to do something a little bit outside of the program or just outside of the program, please feel free to contact us. We will be very sensitive to your relationship with the school district, but staying within the program guidelines and requirements is ultimately your responsibility. Auditing. We all know that when you go in to audit a facility, there are a number of things that are just generally good ideas you might look at, and there are also some suggestions or requests from the school district to look at certain things. That is perfectly fine and understandable. We appreciate your willingness to work with the school districts in this regard. But just because a school district thinks that LEDs are the greatest thing ever because the school district down the road said, we got some LEDs in the gym and they're working great, we're saving millions of dollars, you should get some, doesn't mean it's the best option for that school. You all, as the qualified auditors, are the ones to help the school understand what a better option may be. That doesn't mean you may not or should not investigate the solution that was suggested to you, but if there are other options, it is really incumbent on you to inform the district of their opportunities. Next, access into SID, the School Interactive Database. Please note that there are two different ways to get into or log into SID. One is as a auditor. You all have login and password information or credentials that will allow you to access SID and get certain information. You are all often provided information from the school district for their login to access some of their information. Both of those things are fine, but please understand if you do log into SID as a school, you will not be able to do some of the things you are able to do if you log in as an auditor. So please make sure when you do log in as an auditor to submit documents and do the things you need to do. If you're ever unsure, you may always contact us and we'd be happy to make sure you do it in the right way. Next item, scope of work approval form. Here's another very simple document that has become a little bit cumbersome for some folks. Scope of work approval form is quite simply a very quick document to make sure that the school district, the audit firm, and ODO are all very clear on exactly what is proposed to be done, where it is to be done, and how much it will cost. That is it. If it is a simple whole building audit, a checkbox is sufficient. If it's a targeted audit, a checkbox is sufficient sometimes, maybe additional information depending on the EEMs chosen. Ultimately, it is supposed to be something that is done before a contract is executed. I am fully aware of the difficulties in going through this process in that order. However, if you do not wish to revise your contract with the school district or do any sorts of tweaks to your agreement, getting that scope of work approval form approved by ODO first will help you avoid any missteps. Next, audit costs. We mentioned earlier that we will be looking at audit costs and adhering to ASHRAE Standard 100. This will be information that we will be checking for each and every scope of work approval form. If your fees for a facility exceed 10% of the annual energy costs for that facility, we do ask for justification. And that justification may or may not be accepted, but we do ask for it. Next, and this is an important one for everyone to understand, and I believe it's a question that was asked earlier. Thank you. Whole building versus targeted audits. Before I get to future revisions, that's fine. Whole building audits are the whole building audits that you are very familiar with. They're the audits that must be done on a facility if they've never been audited before. Once a whole building audit is done, and that looks at all energy using systems that have a potential for a project that will have a 50-year or less payback are analyzed, then we may move to a targeted audit. The concept of the targeted audit has a couple of different goals. One is that if fewer measures do need to be analyzed than in a whole building audit, this allows us to do that. This would allow us to look at a building that wanted to change out some lights and had been audited previously. A targeted audit would absolutely be appropriate. If you are looking at more than one measure, a targeted audit can still be appropriate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, any number of measures less than the entirety of the measures potentially to be analyzed in a building would be considered a targeted audit. There is a catch, however, and we actually came across this. If you find that a building is to be audited for a number of measures, whether it's lighting, HVAC, a handful, not the entirety, and that study is going to be done in the same place at the same time, and by that I mean the same facility more or less at the same time, not necessarily the same day. It could be a couple weeks apart or a week apart, but relatively the same project. That is a single targeted audit. A targeted audit may have one or more measures analyzed. The only difference from a whole building is that those measures are identified beforehand and then analyzed. If you find that in the approach to doing a targeted audit, you reach a number of measures that pushes that fee for that audit above what would be 10% for the building and or a whole building audit, then simply a whole building audit is the most appropriate. And we'd also have to question why the fees are exceeding that 10%. But again, the idea is if you are doing fewer than all of the measures, potential measures to be analyzed in a building, you will perform a targeted audit. And again, that targeted audit is intended to look at one or more measures more or less at the same time. Hopefully this is clear. Last item, there was a question earlier about the additional information required or detail required, and that is something that was addressed. But I want to address it in one other way. All of these items are being done in a way to move forward as quickly as possible. We fully understand that the best way for you all to make as much profit, if you will, on each of these contracts is to do only the work necessary to get the document approved and get the school district the information they need. We have no desire to add any additional work or effort on your part. To do that, however, we do need to have everybody doing the exact same thing in the exact same way. That's the best way for us to be able to respond to you as quickly as possible. Therefore, it may look as if more information is required, but again, you are more than welcome to check your contracts. We are not asking for anything additional. We have streamlined this as much as possible. Lastly, if a scope of work approval form is provided to ODO and the costs are above 10% of the annual energy costs, question was raised, will that scope of work approval form be rejected? No, not necessarily. If the justification is warranted, those fees will be approved, absolutely. The goal of the adherence to ASHRAE Standard 100 is really to help the school districts use as much money, public purpose charge funds as possible on those projects, and then use additional funds for future studies, but have them be as focused as possible. Now we're ready to move on. Okay, so the final item, future revisions. We do want you to know that we do expect and request that you follow these changes to the letter for the near future. The idea being we need to track the process, make sure it's running as well as it can be, and see how well it is running before we're willing to make additional changes. We are, however, very willing to make additional changes, especially improvements. We won't know what those are until we have given this a good effort, and therefore we do expect you to follow through on it. Those future revisions will come after discussions with you all and other technical working groups, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but we do intend to have those at least once or twice a year going forward. Additionally, we discussed that changes to the guidelines or the program can be made. Those changes will be posted on Odo's website, and you will all be informed of them, and it will be happening in this way. Smaller changes that are changing the guidelines or anything else that are relatively minor will be put on the website and will be made noted. Larger changes, more substantive changes, changes that will affect the way you do work or what type of work you do, you will all be informed beforehand. The changes will be made, and you will be told exactly when those changes are expected to be implemented. We do not intend to catch you off guard. As a matter of fact, if we do, that will be on us. Lastly, you can see our website there where the changes will be held up. And I believe, next steps, I forgot about that part, my apologies. So very quickly, we are having the auditor training right now. This will be an annual training. This is a required training if you look at your contracts. It's something that we will be checking to make sure all auditors have registered and viewed this webinar, which will be made available online. Next, we do intend to have a schools program work group. This will be a stakeholder work group with school districts and possibly audit firms and other stakeholders. We hope to have this once or twice a year beginning early next year. We also will have training programs similar to this one, but for schools. We do understand and very much appreciate the fact you all have been educating many of these schools for years on this program, and we want to help you in this regard. It is absolutely useful for you to provide that information, but if we can do it in a way that lightens your load, we're very happy and willing to do that. And we'll be doing that at least once or twice a year, again, starting early next year. Lastly, as I said, the qualified audit firm trainings will be happening at least once a year, if not more often. We do fully anticipate additional questions. Please submit those in writing here or follow up in emails. We will be putting together an FAQ and providing that information. We do want to keep that, the lines of communication open as we go forward. But with that, that's the end of our presentation. We have some questions I think that we need to answer. So please feel free to stay on the line. If you do need to leave, again, we will put this information up online as well as questions and answers probably next week, at least for the Q&A. Thank you very much for your time. We do appreciate it. And if you'd like to stick around, we have some questions to answer. Do we have questions to answer? I take that back.
So one of the questions we've received is if whole building audits that are measuring all of the systems are being done, does the 10% rule apply? Yes. Aren't whole building audits based on square footage? We do ask for your cost per square footage in your contract, and if you provide a cost that looks like it's outside of the rates you put in your contract compared to the square footage listed for the school in the scope of work, we would have questions about those costs. Again, the 10% rule is meant to address some stakeholder feedback about audit costs and making sure that audits are directed at identifying measures and where the program can then use those funds to get measures implemented. So the 10% rule is a way of us trying to address audit costs and making sure that they're reasonable. But if justification is provided and that is reasonable, especially with a deep dive into buildings or a certain building system, that is open for explanation, justification, and review and potential exceptions in the scope of work. And there will be a line in the scope of work approval form for you to address the cost versus what's being covered. Next is Odo still requesting to edit audit data into SID twice, once before QZ and again after the reports are final. Entry into SID is our timeline or milestone where we can mark when that report was entered. That's what we consider the official receive date. As some of you know, we go back and forth with some revisions. We try not to make you put every revised report up there. Sometimes we can do that internally. But after the reports are final, we do ask you to initiate that final upload of the final report. Check to make sure the measures in SID are accurate. We do know there is a lockout period, and our staff are happy to help complete this task if you're locked out after that time period. But we do want entry into SID initiated by the auditor.
Thank you, and please understand that one of an additional reason for having the auditor do this is a rule of thumb that we've tried to incorporate in the program as well, which is to say one of the issues we've come across is data transfer sometimes creates mistakes. We've all done it, and the fewer times, the fewer number of people take data and move it, the fewer opportunities for mistakes are made. And ultimately, as Casey said, and this really is the crux of it, the auditor's final upload of the report into SID lets us know that that final QC was done, and therefore the information into SID is what the auditor expects. We will, of course, check things periodically, but again, the ball's in your court on this one, and we want to make sure we do not do anything to inhibit you from doing as good a job as possible.
And a best practice that some of you have already done with us, but when you initiate a report into SID or update measures or put that final report in, sending a quick email to the staff you're working with to let them know it's helpful. Our database is a little bit old, so sometimes those notifications are hard to track always, so it is really best when you guys communicate with us and let us know when those reports are up and ready to go. We'll confirm with an email back. And we're also able to provide training and help for any auditors who haven't worked in SID to initiate a profile, take you through the steps to do that so you can do it quickly and easily and hopefully not be too cumbersome for you.
Okay, well, we will stick around for a little while longer in case any additional questions come in, but we wanted to thank you again very much for your time today. We do understand that there is a bit of effort in learning the new template, making sure you get your systems kind of set up for these changes. But we want to let you know that we are truly excited about the changes. We do very much anticipate great improvements in throughput. The idea of having backlogs lasting for months is an idea we hope to have go away very soon. And we're excited to see what you guys are able to produce and hopefully do it in much less time and less effort. So with that said, thank you again very much. We will stick around, and we look forward to receiving your future audit reports in the new format. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day, and the presentation will be put up online hopefully by the end of this week. Q&A we hope to have by the end of next week. Thank you.